This is the Swedish history podcast, the Gustav Vasa Path to Power. This is the last episode in the story of how a nobleman, Gustav Eriksson Vasa, became the Swedish king during the dramatic years of 1520 until 1523. When the events of this episode start, the bloodbath in Stockholm, November 1520, was over. The resistance against the Union King Christian II was crushed. Now Christian II started his Eriksgata, which was a traditional journey that all kings made through Sweden when they were newly crowned. Usually an Eriksgata is about people standing by the roadside cheering when the king's carriage comes by, and ceremonies around the country to celebrate the new king. Not during Christian II Eriksgata. Christian II chose to continue to murder people who had opposed him. He killed people in many towns such as Linköping, Jönköping and other places, and in January 1521 he and his men came to Nydala monastery in Småland, and here he drowned the abbot and many monks. The survivors of Nydala are the ones who started to call Christian II the tyrant, as he is still called here in Sweden. Christian the Tyrant. In many places, like Småland, local rebellions were formed. At this time, December and January 1520-21, another uprising started in Dalarna. This is how Gustav Eriksson Vasa comes into the story. Gustav Vasa did not go to the coronation ceremony in early November 1520, probably because he didn't trust Christian II after his prison term in Denmark. This suspicious character saved his life. So when he heard about the bloodshed in Stockholm and that his father was among the dead, he went to the province of Dalarna, since the Dala people were known to be good peasant fighters. Many times Dalarna had been fighting in Stockholm for different leaders and kings, both 1471 and 1497 for example. At first Gustav Vasa held a low profile in Dalarna, working with the harvest and working as a helper on farms. But people who was on the side of the Union King were looking for him, and after all he was a fugitive from a house arrest in Denmark. And also he was the son of one of the victims of Stockholm bloodbath. He was a threat to the king, even though a small one at the time. Therefore Gustav Vasa needed to change his hiding places many times. He came to Rankhyttan in Dalarna and later to Ornässtugan. Both of these places are still there to see. In Ornässtugan it is said that he had to flee from the Union loyalist soldiers. After some weeks, Gustav Vasa came to Rättvik and later to Mora. Now he started to try to convince people that they had to stand up against Christian II. The Dalarna people were not interested at first in Gustav Vasa, so he decided to go on towards the Norwegian border. But when the Dalmasar heard about the Stockholm bloodbath, they changed their minds and called Gustav back. When Gustav was called back, he was made one of the leaders of an uprising. But he was not the military leader at the time, more of a political figure or a symbol. This was because he was from a noble family. The military knowledge of the uprising came from farmers who were skilled fighters. During spring of 1521, the battle against the forces loyal to Christian II began. And the Dalarna movement won in south of Dalarna, in Västerås, in Uppsala and other places. And now the uprising spread. Gustav Vasa spent also time traveling around to convince more and more regions to join the uprising. During August of 1521, Gustav Vasa had been so successful that even some of those priests who had accepted Christian II as the new king in November 1520 switched side. And this paved the way for Gustav to be appointed as the new national director, riksföreståndare. One of the most important bishops at this time was the one in Linköping, Hans Brask, and he switched side at this time. In 1522, more and more places were conquered and more leaders from the Danish side started to support the Gustav side. One by one, the leading figures from Stockholm bloodbath now disappeared or fled. Didrik Slaghäck, the Dane who had led the killing at Stortorget, had first been appointed Bishop of Skara after one of the bishops he had killed at Stortorget. And he was also appointed Danish Archbishop in Lund. But when the Pope in Rome learned that Slaghäck had executed 2 bishops, he was arrested and later burned at the stake. Gustav Trolle, the Swedish Archbishop, who was on Denmark's side and who had started the Stockholm bloodbath, was forced to flee to Denmark as early as 1521. He never returned to Sweden. It didn't go very well for Christian II either, when his plan for a Nordic trading company controlled from Copenhagen became known by the mighty Hanseatic League in Lubeck. This led to the Hanseatic League supporting Gustav Vasa. Now nobles in Denmark began to abandon Christian II. Christian lost his crown, which was passed to his uncle. And now Gustav also used his contacts he had made in the German town of Lubeck and got them to lend him some battleships and knights. The German help to Gustav Vasa was essential in beating the Danish side, but for the Germans it was also important to make Gustav Vasa the Swedish king. They were realists and knew that if Gustav became king, they would get paid for the ships and the knights. He would also make the Hanseatic Trade League to get monopoly on the trade in the Baltic area. All ideas of a competing Nordic trade league controlled by Denmark would be abandoned. So there were a lot of arguments why Gustav Vasa needed to be the new king of Sweden. And on June 6, 1523, Gustav Eriksson Vasa was elected king of Sweden. That happened in Strängnäs. At this time, nobody thought that he would start a new dynasty and become one of Sweden's most important kings. Gustav Vasa was seen by many as an usurper, someone who had stolen the crown and taken the throne by force. Many people thought that he would not last very long. This perception around Europe made it hard for Gustav to find a princess to marry. Nobody wanted to give away a daughter to marry a king who soon would be dead. Gustav Vasa had to wait 8 years before he found a wife whose father was willing to accept Gustav Vasa. So, how shall we look upon Gustav Vasa today? The story of his time in Dalarna and how he fought all the way to become a king is a national legend. But is it true? The problem with this story is that there are very few sources from the actual events. It was Gustav Vasa himself who dictated the story in the 1550s, 30 years after the events. He did so in a propaganda book whose purpose was to give legitimacy to his son, Eric. The book is quite interesting, however. It begins by describing how Gustav Vasa was born as a true knight and that he was a hero even as an infant. Through his life he was always on the righteous side and he always makes the most wise decisions. When you know that all of this is something that Gustav Vasa himself told someone who took dictation and wrote it down, you should probably take the details of the story from Dalarna with a large pinch of salt, although it must be proven that the rebellion led by Vasa started in Dalarna and spread across the country. History would later show that Gustav Vasa was almost as cruel as Christian II, and he executed many people who stood in his way or was in opposition to him, especially during the Dacke uprising in the 1540s. But at the same time, Gustav Vasa left Sweden stronger than when he became king in 1523. And he made many decisions that was very important during his time. He started the Swedish Reformation from Catholicism to Protestantism, and he also built up a national army, and this paved the way for Sweden being one of the great powers of Europe in the 1600s. Gustav Vasa was Swedish king until 1560, when he died at age 64. He was succeeded by his son Eric, who became Eric the 14th. Thanks for listening to the Swedish history, the Gustav Vasa Path to Power. You will find more material on my website johanrominhistory.substack.com. Thanks for all support. Bye for now.